On the afternoon of Saturday, August 1st, residents on the north side of Spokane, Washington, watched smoke turn into an advancing wall of flame with almost no warning at all. Within hours, entire neighborhoods that had been quiet residential streets that morning were reduced to smoldering foundations, and by the time officials could even begin assessing the damage, tens of thousands of people had already fled their homes carrying whatever they could grab on the way out the door. This is a real, ongoing disaster unfolding right now in Washington's second largest city, and the numbers behind it are genuinely staggering. So let's walk through exactly what happened, why it escalated so quickly, and what the situation actually looks like as recovery efforts continue. Let's start with the raw scale of what's actually occurred, because the numbers here are substantial, even by the standards of a typically difficult Western wildfire season. What's now being called the Spokane Complex Fire, or in some official reporting, the Spokane Area Fires, is actually made up of 3 separate blazes that ignited within the same general region over the same weekend, the Old Trails Fire, which alone destroyed 640 structures. It became the largest single component of the complex, along with the Fairview Fire and the Autumn Lane Fire burning simultaneously nearby. According to figures from the Federal Incident Management Team, coordinating the overall response, the Old Trails Fire had burned roughly 3,619 acres, the Autumn Lane Fire roughly 3,351 acres, and the Fairview Fire a smaller but still significant 1,056 acres, together adding up to just over 8,000 acres burned across the broader complex in the fire's early, most active phase. Combined, these 3 fires had burned somewhere between 8,000 and roughly 5,400 acres, depending on exactly which agency's most recent figures you're looking at, since containment lines and mapped perimeters were shifting rapidly hour by hour in the fire's early, most active phase, and different agencies involved in the response were tracking slightly different boundaries as the situation continued to evolve. Washington's governor described the unfolding disaster in blunt terms, and Spokane's mayor, Lisa Brown, called it the worst natural disaster our region has faced. Language that isn't hyperbole given that this fire tore directly through populated residential neighborhoods inside city limits, not the more remote forested backcountry where wildfires more typically occur. As of the most recent reporting, more than 700 structures have been confirmed destroyed across the fire zone, the vast majority of them homes, though officials have been clear that number is very likely to climb further as damage assessment teams continue working through neighborhoods that are still too dangerous to fully access. Evacuation orders at their peak affected roughly 65,000 people within Spokane city limits alone, an extraordinary number for a single wildfire event, representing a meaningful percentage of the entire city's population forced from their homes over the course of a single weekend. Genuinely remarkable, given the scale of destruction. No deaths and no major injuries have been reported as of the most recent updates, though authorities have stressed repeatedly that it remains early in the response effort. And search and welfare check teams spent the first several days systematically working through hundreds of missing person reports, most of which were resolved as people who had evacuated safely but hadn't yet been able to check in with concerned family members amid disrupted cell service and chaotic evacuation conditions. CPOL Mark Gregory of the Spokane County Sheriff's Office specifically noted that crews had cleared more than 200 missing person reports within the first couple of days alone, a genuinely labor-intensive process that typically involves deputies and volunteer search teams physically visiting last known addresses, checking with neighbors and family members, and cross-referencing evacuation shelter registration lists. Precisely the kind of methodical, unglamorous work that rarely makes headlines but plays an essential role in giving a community accurate, confirmed information rather than allowing rumor and uncertainty to spread during an already frightening event. So what actually caused a fire to explode this quickly through a populated city rather than staying contained to the kind of remote wilderness area most people picture when they hear the word wildfire? The answer comes down to a specific, dangerous combination of weather conditions that meteorologists and fire officials had actually been warning about in advance. The National Weather Service had issued red flag warnings ahead of the weekend, specifically citing elevated fire weather conditions, including sustained northwest winds gusting up to 35 miles per hour, combined with unusually dry conditions across the region. A red flag warning is the National Weather Service's most serious fire weather designation, issued specifically when a combination of low humidity, dry fuels, and strong sustained wind creates conditions where any fire that does ignite, regardless of the cause, has a genuinely elevated chance of spreading rapidly and becoming difficult to control. And fire agencies across the region typically respond to that kind of warning by pre-positioning additional firefighting resources and increasing public messaging around fire risk in the days leading up to the warning period. Washington Senator Maria Cantwell described the fires as being driven by what she called a historic weather event. And that description lines up with exactly the kind of volatile setup fire meteorologists watch for most closely. Strong, sustained wind capable of pushing flames rapidly across the landscape, combined with vegetation and terrain dry enough to ignite and spread almost instantly once a fire actually breaks out. This particular weekend's conditions arrived at the tail end of what had already been one of the hottest and driest stretches of the summer across the inland Northwest, meaning grass, brush, and forest fuels throughout the region were already primed and ready to burn well before the wind event itself even arrived. A combination fire behavior analysts sometimes describe as the fuel being cured, essentially meaning vegetation has dried out to the point where it ignites and spreads with almost none of the natural resistance that greener, moister vegetation would normally provide. Under those specific conditions, a fire doesn't need to originate in a remote forest to become genuinely catastrophic. It can start relatively close to developed areas and, propelled by strong, sustained wind, cover enormous ground and jump directly into residential neighborhoods within a matter of hours, rather than the days or weeks a more typical, slower-moving wildfire might take to threaten populated areas. It's worth understanding exactly why Spokane specifically sits in a genuinely vulnerable position for this kind of event, since the city's geography plays a real role in the story here. Spokane sits in what's sometimes called the wildland-urban interface, a term fire scientists use to describe areas where developed neighborhoods directly border undeveloped, vegetation-covered land, rather than being clearly separated from it by open agricultural land or other natural fire breaks. Large sections of the city, particularly on its north side, where the worst of this weekend's damage occurred, sit immediately adjacent to pine forest and dry grassland terrain typical of the broader inland northwest region, meaning a fire igniting in that adjacent wildland can, under the right wind conditions, transition directly into an urban conflagration burning through residential streets with genuinely alarming speed, exactly the scenario that played out here. This isn't a uniquely Spokane-specific vulnerability either. It's the same basic geographic and climate pattern that has driven several of the most destructive, headline-generating wildfire disasters across the American West over the past decade. Communities built directly against fire-prone wildland terrain, increasingly experiencing the kind of hot, dry, windy conditions that turn a manageable brush fire into a genuine urban disaster within hours. It's also worth noting that Spokane has a genuine, if largely forgotten, history with exactly this kind of urban fire risk. The city was almost entirely destroyed by a massive downtown fire back in 1889, an event that reshaped the city's development and building codes for generations afterward. Though that historical fire, driven primarily by dense wooden construction downtown rather than adjacent wildland vegetation, represents a somewhat different kind of urban fire risk than the wildland-urban interface dynamic driving this weekend's disaster. The response effort mobilized quickly and at a genuinely significant scale once the severity of the situation became clear. President Trump approved a federal emergency declaration specifically for the Spokane complex fire, unlocking FEMA resources to support the response and eventual recovery effort, and a federal incident management team was brought in to help coordinate firefighting operations across what had, by that point, become a genuinely complex multi-agency response spanning local fire departments, state resources, and federal wildfire management personnel, all working simultaneously across the affected region. A federal emergency declaration of this kind is a genuinely significant step in disaster response, since it unlocks direct financial and logistical support that goes well beyond what local and state resources alone could typically provide, including funding for individual assistance to affected households, support for debris removal, and reimbursement for a portion of the costs local and state agencies incur while responding to and recovering from the disaster. A process that, based on similar past wildfire disasters of comparable scale, will likely continue playing out over months rather than weeks, as damage assessments are finalized and assistance programs get fully underway. 2 evacuation shelters, including the Spokane Convention Center, opened to house-displaced residents, while the local community organized its own parallel relief effort, raising more than $5 million for wildfire relief within just the first few days, a genuine reflection of how directly this disaster touched the broader Spokane community, even beyond the specific neighborhoods that burned. Local organizations, including community centers like the Rose Creek Longhouse, opened their doors specifically to provide displaced residents with a safe space to gather, access information, and connect with the practical resources they needed in the disorienting first days after being forced from their homes, a genuinely important piece of disaster response that often gets less attention than the firefighting effort itself, but plays an enormous role in how affected communities actually cope in a disaster's immediate aftermath. More than 40,000 utility customers lost power at the height of the crisis, adding another layer of difficulty for both the firefighting effort itself and for residents throughout the broader region trying to stay informed and safe during an already chaotic weekend. As the days following the initial outbreak have passed, the situation has genuinely begun to stabilize, even though full containment remains an ongoing effort. Cooler temperatures and calmer winds moved into the region within a couple of days of the fire's initial explosive growth, giving firefighters a genuine opportunity to make what officials described as significant gains against the blaze after that critical, most dangerous initial window had passed. Fire crews used this improved weather window to begin establishing and reinforcing containment lines around the perimeter of all three fires making up the complex, a painstaking process that typically involves clearing vegetation down to bare soil in a continuous line around the fire's edge, either using bulldozers and hand crews on the ground, or, in less accessible terrain, water and fire retardant dropped from aircraft, all specifically designed to starve the advancing fire of fuel once it reaches the cleared boundary. By the most recent updates, some evacuation zones had already been downgraded from the most severe Level 3 orders, meaning leave immediately, down to Level 2, meaning be prepared to leave on short notice, allowing at least some residents to begin the difficult process of returning to check on their properties, though officials have continued warning people not to return to any area still under active evacuation orders, and to exercise real caution around ash and debris even in areas where evacuations have been lifted, specifically recommending N95, NIOSH, or 100 rated masks for anyone in the area who might need to work around or breathe in residual smoke and ash. Spokane County Emergency Management has continued issuing regular public updates as containment progresses, and officials have specifically cautioned returning residents to watch for hazards that aren't always immediately obvious after a fire passes through, including weakened trees that could fall without warning, damaged utility lines, and hotspots that can remain dangerously smoldering beneath ash for days or even weeks after the visible flame front has moved on. This disaster hasn't happened in isolation either, and it's worth understanding the broader context it's unfolding within, since the Spokane Complex fire is only one part of a genuinely difficult wildfire season playing out across Washington and the broader American West this year. Governor Ferguson issued a statewide burn ban and specifically described the broader situation as a particularly dangerous situation, as roughly 10 separate wildfires burned simultaneously across different parts of Washington state. And by some estimates, roughly 386 square miles have burned across the state so far this season, a genuinely enormous total area, even setting aside the specific concentrated tragedy that struck Spokane directly. Other fires burning simultaneously across the state during this same stretch included the Espanola fire near Medical Lake, which prompted its own evacuation orders before eventually being downgraded, and additional Level 1 evacuations issued for residents near Rathdrum, illustrating just how widely stretched firefighting resources across the state genuinely became during this particularly active stretch of the season. That broader pattern connects directly back to the historically severe heat that gripped much of the western and central United States throughout July, a summer defined by a genuinely unusual sequence of powerful, record-breaking heat domes settling over different parts of the country, one after another, drying out vegetation and setting the stage for exactly the kind of explosive fire behavior that struck Spokane once the wind-driven ignition conditions finally aligned. The Washington Post specifically reported that July 2026 was tracking to become the warmest month on record across the entire United States, surpassing the previous record set back in July of 2012, a genuinely significant climatological benchmark that helps explain why so much of the vegetation across the inland Northwest was primed and ready to burn by the time this particular weekend's dangerous wind event finally arrived. Researchers who study the connection between rising global temperatures and wildfire behavior have consistently found that hotter, drier conditions extend the length of fire season, increase the total area burned annually across the American West, and make the kind of explosive, wind-driven fire growth seen in Spokane this weekend measurably more frequent than it was several decades ago. A trend line that this particular disaster, unfortunately, fits squarely within. It's genuinely worth sitting with just how quickly a situation like this can escalate for anyone living in a similarly fire-prone region, because the practical lessons from this specific disaster carry real, direct relevance well beyond Spokane itself. Officials involved in the response have repeatedly emphasized that residents in the wildland-urban interface should have an evacuation plan and a go-bag prepared well before fire season's most dangerous stretch actually arrives, since the Old Trails fire in particular demonstrated just how little warning a wind-driven, rapidly spreading fire can actually give a neighborhood before flames arrive at the property line. A well-prepared go-bag for exactly this kind of emergency typically includes essential medications, copies of important documents like identification and insurance paperwork, a change of clothes, phone chargers, and enough water and non-perishable food to last several days, packed and ready to go at a moment's notice, rather than something residents try to assemble in the panicked, disorienting minutes after an evacuation order is actually issued. Emergency management officials across fire-prone regions of the West have increasingly emphasized exactly this kind of proactive preparation in recent years, precisely because events like this one keep demonstrating that the gap between a red flag warning being issued and an actual structure-destroying fire reaching a populated neighborhood can be measured in hours rather than the days. Some residents might instinctively assume they'd have to prepare and evacuate calmly. Homeowners in wildland-urban interface areas are also increasingly encouraged to maintain what fire agencies call defensible space around their property, clearing dry brush, dead vegetation, and other flammable material within at least the first several feet surrounding a home's foundation. A relatively modest, ongoing maintenance effort that fire behavior research has repeatedly shown can make a genuinely meaningful difference in whether an individual structure survives when a wildfire does eventually reach a neighborhood. So, where does this situation genuinely stand right now as recovery efforts continue? Firefighters have made real, meaningful progress against all three fires making up the Spokane complex, aided considerably by the calmer, cooler weather that moved in behind the initial, most dangerous wind event. Though full containment across such a large, complicated fire perimeter running directly through residential terrain remains an ongoing, resource-intensive effort rather than something achieved in a single dramatic turning point. The confirmed structure loss, sitting somewhere north of 700 buildings destroyed as of the most recent damage assessments, represents a genuine, significant tragedy for the specific families and businesses affected, even as the broader community response, the federal emergency declaration, the rapid fundraising effort, and the fact that no deaths have been reported despite the sheer scale of destruction, all point toward a response effort that, while dealing with genuinely severe damage, has managed to prevent this disaster from becoming even more catastrophic than it already is. For anyone in the Spokane area right now, the most current, reliable information continues to come directly from Spokane County Emergency Management's official updates and evacuation maps, rather than secondhand reporting, since conditions on the ground, containment percentages, and evacuation zone boundaries have continued shifting meaningfully day by day as this recovery effort moves forward.